I followed my mother in the same post, and my father before that, so it does cover a good many years.
The Duke of Kent spent his entire life in loyal service to the British Crown, never once speaking out of turn. He had watched the royal family change around him for years, and before he ran out of time, he chose one woman over another to inherit his jewel collection. But what did he know that nobody else was saying? Let's uncover the truth. The Duke of Kent. The Duke of Kent had lived a life that very few people could truly understand. He had carried the title of Duke of Kent for more than 8 decades, making him one of the longest serving in the entire history of the British royal family. He had stood at the graveside of kings. He had watched queens be crowned. He had served in the military, traveled the world on behalf of the crown, and shown up at every event and ceremony that was asked of him without complaint. By the time he reached his 90s, he had become one of the last living connections to a version of the monarchy that most people only knew from old photographs and black and white film footage. He was a man who had seen everything, and he had kept almost all of it to himself. For most of his life, that silence was simply who he was. He had been raised in a royal tradition that valued discretion above almost everything else. You did not speak about what happened inside the family. The Duke had followed that tradition faithfully for decades, even when it was difficult, even when he disagreed with decisions, even when he watched things unfold around him that he felt deeply uncomfortable about. His silence was not the silence of someone who had nothing to say. It was the silence of someone who had made a choice, over and over again, to put the institution before himself. He served, he appeared, and he kept the inner life of the institution protected from outside view. The passing of his wife, Catherine, in the autumn of 2025 changed something in him. They had been married for more than 60 years, and she had been his closest companion through everything. Her passing left a void beside him that nothing could fill, and the people who saw him in the weeks afterward noticed that he seemed different. Not broken exactly, but changed. The careful restraint that had defined him for so long seemed to have loosened. He appeared at the National Service of Remembrance at the cenotaph, just weeks after his wife passed away, standing among the other senior royals, supported by Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh. He was still dignified, still composed in public, but those around him could sense that something had shifted in how he related to the time he had left. He seemed less concerned with protecting the future and more focused on settling the past. Those who watched him that day saw a man who was still present, still committed to his duties, but carrying something heavier than grief. He stood for the full duration of the service with the same stillness he had always brought to public occasions. But when it was over and he returned to Kensington Palace, the change in him was visible. He moved more slowly, he spoke more carefully, and he had begun returning to subjects he had never raised before. Kensington Palace had been his home for many years, and in those final weeks, it became the setting for a very different kind of conversation. The household around him was small. He had never been a royal who surrounded himself with large numbers of people or built a visible inner circle. The people present in those final weeks were few and trusted, and what they began to witness was a man who had made a decision. The urgency in him was quite unmistakable. Those around him understood that he was not simply settling practical affairs, the way most people do when their health is declining. He was not confused or distressed. Neither was he looking for reassurance. He was working his way towards something with the same focus he had always brought to his duties, only now that focus was turned inward toward the things he had never said. He was preparing to make a statement. He kept returning to certain subjects, circling them carefully, adding a detail here and a feeling there. Building towards something that those present began to understand was important to him in a way that went beyond ordinary wishes. He had opinions about the royal family. He had opinions about where it was heading and about the people who were shaping its future. He had held those opinions for a long time, and he was no longer willing to leave without voicing them. What made the situation so unusual was precisely who he was. He was not a scandalous figure or someone whose relationship with the institution had been complicated. He was one of its most loyal and longest-serving members, a man who had dedicated his entire adult life to supporting the crown without asking for recognition or reward. When a man like the Duke of Kent decided to speak, people listened, and the people around him in those final weeks understood that what he was preparing to say was not casual. It was something he had been carrying for years, something that had grown more pressing with every passing month, something that, in the end, he decided could not be left unspoken. The household around him held its breath and waited until he came to it in his own time. And when he finally spoke, the words he chose were clear, direct, and impossible to misunderstand. A private collection with a complicated history. The Duke's final wishes carried so much weight because of what he actually possessed and where those possessions had come from. The collection of jewels and royal heirlooms that had passed through the Kent family wasn't just a simple collection of expensive objects. It was a physical record of a history that stretched back through generations of European royalty, through royal marriages and political crisis and the kind of family connections that bound the crowned houses of Europe together before 2 world wars changed everything. Each piece in the collection carried a story behind it, and the Duke had grown up knowing those stories. The most important figure in the story of the Kent collection was his mother, Princess Marina. Marina had been born into the Greek royal family, the daughter of Prince Nicholas of Greece and Denmark. She had grown up in the courts of Europe and had carried with her into her marriage to Prince George, the Duke of Kent, a set of jewels that reflected the extraordinary reach of her origins. Some of the most significant pieces in her collection had connections to the Russian imperial court, passed down through the family of Grand Duchess Vladimir. These were objects that had survived the Russian Revolution only through luck and courage. They had been hidden, moved through Sweden, and eventually made their way into the hands of Marina's family. By the time they arrived in Britain with Marina, they carried within them the memory of a world that had been almost entirely destroyed. Marina herself became one of the most admired figures in the British royal family. She was elegant, stylish, and deeply committed to her royal duties even after the early demise of her husband, Prince George, who lost his life in a military air crash in 1942. She raised her children largely alone while continuing to serve the crown with total dedication. The jewels she wore at public occasions became closely associated with her image, and when she passed away in 1968, the collection went her children. The Duke of Kent had received his share of it as both an inheritance and a responsibility, and he treated it as such throughout his life. Among the most celebrated pieces connected to the family were the Cambridge sapphires, which had come to Marina as a wedding gift from Queen Mary. These were not ordinary gemstones. They had their own long journey through royal hands before they reached Marina, and they became one of the most recognizable elements of the family's collection. When Catherine got married to the Duke and became the Duchess of Kent, she wore sapphire pieces at important state occasions over the years, and they became a symbol of the dignity she brought to her role. Beyond the sapphires, the collection included diamond pieces, tiaras, brooches, and a range of other jewels that spoke to the family's deep connections across the royal houses of Europe. Unfortunately, not all of it survived intact. The financial pressures that had weighed on the Kent family across several generations had led to the sale of significant pieces over the decades. Items that had once formed the heart of the collection appeared at auction at Christie's and Sotheby's, acquired by collectors and institutions around the world. Each one represented a small loss of the physical evidence of a long and complicated family history. By the time the Duke reached his final years, what remained was smaller than what had once existed, but it was not less valuable. If anything, the fact that these particular pieces had not been sold said something about how the Duke felt about them. What he retained were pieces that he had decided, consciously and repeatedly, to keep. These were not items he displayed or wore. They were objects he kept in the careful storage that such things require, maintained with the attention that their age and fragility demanded. They were not public treasures in the way that crown jewels are public treasures. They were private ones, belonging to him personally, passing through the family line that connected him back to Marina, and through her to the courts and crises of another era entirely. Their value was not only financial, it was historical, emotional, and deeply symbolic. The Duke had always known that a decision would eventually need to be made about where they would go. That was the nature of such things. Objects outlive their owners, and someone always has to decide what comes next. This was not a decision to be made randomly or impulsively. He had watched for years, observing the people around him, forming views about who understood the weight of what the royal family carried and who did not. Finally, he came to his conclusions slowly, through the long process of observation that comes with decades at the center of an institution, and by the time he reached his final weeks, those conclusions had solidified into something he was ready to express. The collection was not simply going to pass to whoever was nearest or most convenient. It was going to go where he believed it belonged. The final judgment. The Duke had spent most of his adult life watching the royal family from close range. He had been at the center of the institution for so long that he could read it the way other people read a familiar landscape, noticing small changes that outsiders would miss entirely, understanding the significance of things that appeared ordinary on the surface. He had watched members of the family arrive and depart, had seen the institution absorb a lot of pressures and emerge changed by them, and had formed over those decades a set of views about what the monarchy truly required from the people who were part of it. His feelings about Catherine had been building for years before he finally put them into words. She had joined the royal family in 2011 as the wife of Prince William, and from the beginning, the Duke had watched her with the careful attention he gave to anyone who entered the institution. He had seen others come in from outside the family and struggle with what was demanded of them. The loss of privacy was total, and the scrutiny never stopped. The expectations placed on a person in that position were much, and there was very little room for error. Some people who entered that world found ways to manage it that the Duke found troubling. They sought the protection of distance, or they turned to public channels to manage grievances that the Duke believed should have been handled privately. He understood the difficulty, but he also believed that the difficulty was part of what the role required. It was not supposed to be easy. It was supposed to be a commitment. What he observed in Catherine over the years was a commitment of exactly the kind he most respected. She did not retreat from the demands of the role, rather she absorbed them, one by one. And she did so with a consistency that he found impressive. When she faced the loss of her privacy, she did not seek to negotiate it or reduce it. When she was placed under the kind of scrutiny that would have overwhelmed many people, she remained composed. When her health was seriously challenged in 2024, she handled that with a grace and dignity that was rare. She had come back from something serious, returned to her duties with full commitment, and done all of it without making the difficulty of the situation into a story about herself. To the Duke, that was exactly what the institution required. It was not about the individual. It was about what the individual was willing to give. He also saw in Catherine something that spoke to the future in a way that genuinely moved him. She was raising the next generation of the monarchy while supporting William as he prepared to eventually take the throne. She was not a peripheral figure in the story of what the monarchy would become. She was central to it, and the Duke believed that the way a person approached their role said everything about whether they truly understood it. He had watched Catherine closely enough to believe that she did. Meanwhile, his feelings about Camilla came from a different place, and they were considerably more complicated. He had lived through the years when the relationship between Camilla and Prince Charles was a source of serious damage to the institution. He had watched from close range as the marriage of Charles and Diana collapsed, had understood better than most what that had cost the monarchy in terms of public trust and internal coherence. He had seen how the institution had struggled to absorb the fallout, and he had formed views about the people involved that decades had not entirely softened. He was not a man who held personal grudges, and his feelings about Camilla were not simply about the past, but he believed that some histories left marks that could not simply be erased by time or by official acceptance. When Camilla was crowned Queen Consort in 2023, the Duke had accepted it as the settled position of the institution. He had not spoken publicly against it, that was not how he operated, but privately, in the small circle of people he trusted most, he had made clear that he did not feel that Camilla's place at the center of the monarchy carried the same meaning as a position that had been built through genuine sacrifice and commitment. In his view, there was a noticeable difference between the two women, and that difference was crucial when thinking about who should receive something that carried the weight that his collection carried. Catherine held her position not as a burden, but as a responsibility, and in the Duke's view, that distinction mattered. He was not making a legal argument or a political one. He was making a moral one, based on his own long understanding of what the monarchy asked of people and what it deserved in return. In his final weeks, with time short and the people he trusted closest to him, the Duke finally said all of this out. He named Catherine as the person he wanted to receive his collection. He explained why in terms that left no room for any misunderstanding, and he made equally clear that Camilla should not be the recipient of anything from what he had spent his life protecting. It was a statement that had been forming inside him for years. When it finally came out whole. The institutional divide information moved through the royal institution the way it always had, through conversations between people who understood what they were carrying and why it mattered. There was no announcement when word of the Duke's final declaration began to reach the right ears. There was simply the slow, careful passage of a significant thing between people who trusted each other enough to share it and who understood well enough what it meant. This was how the most sensitive matters had always moved inside the monarchy. The first response among those who received the information was a period of careful consideration. This was not unusual in an institution that had long experience managing difficult situations. When something significant and sensitive emerged within the family, the first instinct of the people responsible for managing it was not to act quickly, but to understand fully. At that point, they needed to know what had been said, by whom, to whom, and in what state the Duke had been when he said it. They needed to assess whether what he had expressed constituted a formal wish in any legal sense, or whether it was something that fell into the more ambiguous category of personal feeling expressed in private. These were not small questions. The answers would determine how the institution responded, and the institution was careful about its responses. Among those who had long held a quiet admiration for Catherine, the news arrived with a particular quality. It was not exactly a surprise. Many of the senior figures who had watched her over the years had formed views that were not entirely unlike the Duke's, even if they had never expressed them so directly. What the Duke had done was give voice to something that existed in the institution, but had not been named. He had said the unspoken, and in doing so, he had given it a weight it had not previously possessed. The people who received his words in this spirit felt something close to relief. A sense that a truth had been acknowledged by someone whose authority to acknowledge it was beyond question. The Duke of Kent was not a man whose judgment was doubted within the family. He had earned, over 8 decades of service, a level of credibility that very few living members of the institution could match. For those whose loyalties lay closer to Camilla, the situation was significantly more difficult. Camilla had spent more than 2 years as queen consort by the time the Duke made his final declaration, and her position had been consolidated through the formal processes of the coronation and through the steady accumulation of public duties that came with it. The institution had moved forward. Publicly, the question of her place in the family was settled. She appeared at state occasions, carried out official engagements, and occupied the role that the king had always intended for her. What the Duke had said threatened to introduce a different narrative, one that suggested the settlement was less complete than it appeared, that there were still senior figures within the family who did not accept her position as fully as the official version suggested. The people close to Camilla's household were not immediately certain how to respond. The Duke's words were not the words of someone marginal or easily dismissed. He had been at the center of the institution his entire life. His opinion carried a historical weight that made it difficult to simply set aside. At the same time, his declaration had no formal legal force. It was a statement of personal wish, expressed privately, without the structure of a legally binding document behind it. The people responsible for managing the household of the Prince and Princess of Wales were informed about the Duke's wish. No formal meeting is known to have taken place specifically about this matter, but the information had reached enough people in enough relevant positions that it could not simply be allowed to sit without any form of management. Decisions would need to be made about the collection itself, and those decisions would need to be made in a way that was defensible, both within the family and within the broader institutional framework. The challenge was that defensibility looked different depending on which part of the institution you were standing in. However, institution had mechanisms for managing exactly this kind of situation, and those mechanisms were put into motion. The goal was not to suppress what had been said, but to contain its consequences, to ensure that it did not become the basis for a public story that would require a formal response. What emerged from this initial period of assessment was not a resolution, but a recognition. The Duke's words had introduced a tension that was real, and that would need to be navigated carefully. How it was navigated and by whom was a question that remained open as the institution absorbed what had happened and prepared, in its own careful and gradual way, to decide what came next. The fate of the jewels. The practical management of what the Duke had left behind would begin almost immediately after his passing, handled by the small and careful circle of people responsible for his estate. This is not a simple process. The personal collections of senior royals exist in a complicated legal and institutional space, one where family tradition, historical provenance, and formal legal requirements all intersect in ways that are rarely straightforward. The pieces the Duke had retained from the Kent family collection were his personal property, not crown property, which meant they fell outside the formal structures that govern the disposition of items belonging to the monarch. They were his to leave as he chose. But the question of what he had formally chosen, in a legally binding sense, was less clear than what he expressed in words during his final weeks. The estate is managed with the kind of discretion that had always characterized the Duke's approach to his own affairs. The people involved understand the sensitivity of the situation and the importance of handling it in a way that did not generate public controversy or require formal explanations. Within the royal family, the handling of personal estates is rarely discussed openly. Assets move through the processes of inheritance and administration without public commentary, and the specifics of who receives what are treated as private matters between the family members involved. That was the framework within which the Duke's collection would be managed, and it meant that whatever ultimately happened to the pieces he had spoken about in his final weeks would not be announced or explained in any public forum. Catherine's position throughout this period was one of genuine distance from the decisions being made about her. She had not been part of the conversations the Duke had in his final weeks. She had not been told in any direct way what he had said about her or about his wishes for his collection. The information was circulating within the institution in the careful and private way that such things circulated, but it had not yet reached her in any formal presentation. She was focused during this period on the full return to her duties that had followed her serious health challenges. She had come back to her role with an energy and commitment that those around her described as complete, and the day-to-day demands of that role occupied her fully. The question of whether she would ever receive any part of what the Duke had intended for her remains unresolved until the immediate aftermath of his passing. Those responsible for managing his estate would have to navigate competing considerations, the legal requirements of the estate process, the informal wishes the Duke had expressed, and the institutional sensitivity of the situation. Each of these pulled in slightly different directions, and reconciling them required the kind of reasoning that the institution brought to all of its most difficult internal questions. The decision, whatever it turned out to be, would be made in private and would remain private. What could not be contained in the same way was the effect of the Duke's confession itself. The objects could be managed, they could be redirected, held in trust, reassigned through the formal processes of estate administration. But what the Duke had said about the two women he had named could not be undone by any administrative process. It existed now in the memories of the people who had been present, and those people were still inside the institution. And in a world as small and interconnected as the British royal family, things do not simply disappear. The Duke had understood this perfectly when he made his declaration. He had spent 8 decades inside the institution, and he knew exactly how information moved within it, and what it meant when something was said out loud by someone whose credibility could not be questioned. He was not naive about what would happen, and he knew that his words would not immediately change the formal structures of the institution or alter the settled public position of any of the figures he had named. However, he also knew that what was said in that room would not simply dissolve. It would move. It would reach people. It would become part of the private record of the institution that no official document ever captures, but that shapes, over time, how the family understands itself. His confession was not an act of desperation or of anger. It was a final contribution to that private record, made by a man who had spent his entire life understanding what the monarchy was for and what it required of the people who served it. The Duke of Kent had watched the monarchy change around him, had seen it absorb things that he had not always agreed with, and had kept his peace throughout. In the end, he chose not to keep it entirely. He left behind not just the objects of a long life, but the words that explained what he believed those objects meant and where they deserved to go. Whether the institution honored those words was something he would not live to know. But he had said them clearly, and in an institution where silence is the default, that alone was a remarkable thing.